Welcome back to ThinkTech Talks here on the SOEST Hour, which in this case, for this particular show, is a misnomer. But we're sort of acting under the umbrage of the SOEST people, right?
Sure.
Because we like them. That's the common denominator.
We work with them.
We're calling this New Directions in Environmental Management. Okay, is that acceptable?
Yeah.
Okay. And there's more to it than that. With Brenden Halland, a member of the graduate faculty in Plant and Environmental Protection Sciences at the Center for Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources in Manoa, CITAR, and also Austin Shelton, who is a PhD student in the biology department's Marine Biology Specialization Program at UH-Manoa. And probably they have a lot in common because they're both working in Guam. Half a day.
Half a day.
Yeah. Does that mean everybody works half a day?
I wish.
That's always the joke.
So let's introduce you more fully, though. Let's start with you, Brenden.
Sure.
Tell us how you got to be where you are. The reason I always ask that question is I want those teenagers out there to know how you got there, so they can do exactly the same thing, if possible.
Sure. I'd actually like to start with one minor correction. I'm on the grad faculty in PEPS, but my position is actually in PBRC, so as are you.
What's PBRC?
This is Pacific Biosciences Research Center.
Okay.
So, yeah. Well, I mean, one way I describe sort of how I got where I am is I just never stopped being curious about how, things work, why they are where they are, playing with creatures, and that sort of led to, a study of biodiversity. And that's what I do today.
What is biodiversity?
Yeah, so biodiversity is it's the number of species or lineages in a certain area or place. And why we think this is important now is for ecosystem function. When we start to tamper with that natural distribution of lineages, we see a lot of hard to predict negative impacts to the entire ecosystem, often leading to ecosystem collapse. And so the study of biodiversity is really best exemplified on islands. We have more species on islands per area than anywhere on Earth. And so sometimes we think about islands as sort of biodiversity engines generating many, many species.
Well, but that gives islands an advantage, right? Because they're a laboratory, you can observe more closely, more carefully, and you have more
Great for model systems.
Compare and contrast. So, but let me go back to your training. I mean, so electrical engineering is not in your background at all, then?
No.
I kind of guessed that.
No. So my undergrad is biology from UC San Diego. I focused on marine biology at the time, and I've kind of expanded my horizons as I went through grad school, and now I'll just study any cool project I can get my hands on. So I still keep one foot in the ocean and one in the mountains. So did a master's degree in oceanography at Texas A&M University, and then I continued on with a PhD there.
Okay, and who's your friend?
Well, I brought this little creature in as an example of an invasive species that's wreaking havoc in our island ecosystems. So this is called a Jackson's chameleon.
Okay.
And
maybe we can zoom on that a little bit and try to.
So this is an East African species that is very popular globally in the pet trade. They were brought and released here in the early 1970s and have since become established on all of the main islands.
For a reason. They were brought for a reason.
They were brought for the pet trade. They're real popular pets. You can see why they look like a little miniature dinosaur. They have a lot of neat adaptations. They have a prehensile tail. They're real good climbers, so they're arboreal, meaning they live in trees. They also have binocular vision, which is independent, so they can focus their eyes on different targets simultaneously. They have a tongue strike feeding behavior that's really interesting. So once they see something that they're interested in, they'll focus both eyes on it, and they can fire that tongue out with a hydraulic system, and the length being about as long as from the tip of the tail to the tip of the horns. So they don't move very quickly, except for that tongue strike. They're pretty much invisible to the prey in the trees. And so they're sort of ambush foragers. And
They're not particularly good for our existing environment, huh?
well, so what we've discovered is they're eating our endemic Hawaiian species.
Oh, he's cute. What's his name, Oscar?
We try not to name our invasive species.
You don't want to get
and
too
we
close
don't want
to
to be
him.
too attached. This guy will actually
Yeah.
be released with a radio transmitter, which I think my grad student in here.
He's looking at me.
So
The eye is wandering, like a wandering eye is wandering everywhere.
So you'll notice also he's changing color. That's another
is-
sort of cool natural feature of this species. They can change color to signal to one another intraspecifically, and they can sort of blend in with the background extremely well. So they're highly cryptic. Now this is a radio transmitter that we will epoxy to his flank, and then we'll put him out in the field and then reacquire him on a daily basis.
He's climbing up my arm.
Yes, he is.
Is that
He thinks you're
okay?
A tree, sure.
Well,
Yeah,
I
they're
must say,
harmless
this is
to
really
people.
a treat. This is the first time we've had a live animal in the studio, so, you know, we're always moving in new directions. Well, thank you for bringing him down. What will we do with him during the show? Will he be participating in any way?
You can try. They don't make a lot of noise.
Oh.
You can ask anything you want. He's a good listener if you want to hold him. So the males have the horns. The females have no horns. The males use that in contests for territory, and they're highly territorial species.
Why are they so bad for our environment here?
Well, so about actually 4 years ago, some of my colleagues were hiking through a pristine area monitoring endangered tree snails, which I have a few examples of here. And they happened upon about a dozen of these in a tree where there were actually endangered tree snails in the same habitat. They collected about a dozen of these and brought them to me, and we humanely euthanized them, and then we opened them up, and we found about, I think, 5 endemic tree snail shells inside the guts. So along with a lot of insects, rare insects, Megalagrion is an endangered damselfly that we found in the guts of these things. Now this was the very first time that they'd ever been seen in pristine habitat, and it was also the first time that anyone has documented them preying on native species. So this had a pretty rapid and extreme reaction in the conservation community. We knew these things were established in non-native forest around the islands for decades. But again, this was the first time we'd seen them in pristine forest. So what we think is happening is some sort of range expansion. They're moving upwards possibly into these native, more sensitive areas, and you know, they'll just pretty much eat anything they can swallow. And so when they're in habitat that harbors native species, they're eating native species. And so now there's a pretty big effort to understand their movement behavior, dietary preferences, reproductive strategies, and so we're heavily involved in that. And I have a PhD student, Melissa Wright, who's working full-time on this species, and we have some grant funding to work on this.
They don't have any natural enemies.
Well, here, you're right, they don't. In Kenya, there are a lot of things that specialize on feeding on them. There's a snake, there's a tree snake that eats almost exclusively Jackson's chameleons, and then there's a raptor, a bird of prey that eats these things. So some of the discussion has, towards control, you know, has begun to bring up ideas of possible reintroduction of a native raptor here, the EO. This would follow permitting through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a lot of trials to make sure, you know, there wouldn't be non-target effects of reintroduction of the EO. Also, we'd have to make sure the EO eats these things. Again,
That would be something.
the Hawaiian hawk did not evolve with any lizards at all. There are no native reptiles in Hawaii. So, yeah, these are fairly newcomers to the ecology of the islands.
Are they out of control? Are they
They're
breeding
absolutely out of control. We have a paper in press right now where we modeled the impact in basically half an acre, and the density in that half acre was about 45 chameleons, and we calculated that in a year they can consume and kill 1,000 snails, endangered snails, and that's not a sustainable number. So we're now involved in really trying to come up with some effective control strategies for these guys.
Well, I wonder, people talk about invasive species and talk about the delicate balance, especially in the Hawaiian Islands anyway. Maybe Guam has the same experience. But what is the last station on the railroad? In other words, when these guys get completely out of control and we're in an imbalance about the snails and maybe other things, what happens to the environment then? What should we be worried about, when you reach a crisis level?
Well, I can try to answer that in a few different ways. One thing we know about native forests on islands is that they manage the water in a very natural way that's conducive to health of agriculture and people, human society. A lot of islands where deforestation has occurred, we lose the water. So non-native trees don't do what native forests do, which is water ecosystem function. And so what we see is just tons of examples where deforestation has happened and either the streams dry up or the water quality is very poor, flooding isn't controlled, so after a heavy rain event, we get a ton of erosion which washes downstream, eventually ends up on the reef, smothers coral reefs, and you can have ecosystem collapse due to deforestation, marine as well as terrestrial.
What collapse? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, is it sort of like the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts? I mean, nothing left?
Well, that would be the worst case scenario. I think due to the United States sort of awareness and a lot of federal agencies are focusing on this, we're not at that point yet anywhere in the U.S. that I know of. Florida Keys have some major losses of coral cover, and the fisheries associated with
Caribbean
corals
is in
collapse.
deep trouble.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the U.S. There are lots of places in the world, Philippines, where there's still some unsustainable harvest of corals and fish that's going on. That's leading in the direction of collapse. That's sort of again worst case scenario.
It's funny. It seems to run a parallel to the whole thing about climate change. I mean, we've abused the planet, and we've done this. I mean, he's a nice fellow, but
doesn't belong in the forest.
Doesn't belong in the forest.
Yeah.
He's taking advantage.
Yep.
He's taking advantage, and now I know why you don't want to give him a name.
They're charismatic. They're really nice, but causing a lot of damage to the native ecosystem.
So I mean, it's sort of like climate change in the sense that we have abused the natural flora and fauna and the natural ecology, and there's a price to pay, and it's the same thing too in the sense that when you get past a certain tipping point, you can't bring it back. It's gone.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and I think again, like climate change, we're still in a position, we think, most scientists agree, to slow the process and potentially reverse it. And the same can be said for a lot of invasive species problems. I mean, I'm an optimist, so there are conservation biologists out there who just throw their hands up and say, let's move on to something else that's more tractable. But
well, all these local problems are making it difficult for us to also address those global stressors from climate change, and we need to fix the local problems in order to be resilient against the global problems.
Right. Why fix the global problems if the local problem is unfixable?
That's right.
It all begins at home somehow.
That's a good point. We also think of the islands as sort of microcosms of, continental situations, and again, Hawaii serves as a great example for we're maybe a few steps ahead of a lot of developing island nations, and my work on Guam, as yours probably does, we see so many shared challenges between Hawaii and Guam. And maybe we can talk about that if you want to move into the Guam situation.
But one thought more is that people generally see scientists as moving ahead into unknown territory, finding things, finding science that converts to tech, that makes living on the planet better and easier and so forth. But that's not really what's happening here. You're trying to preserve the planet. just the way the climate change guys are trying to preserve the planet. You're trying to preserve the ecosystem as it has existed for millennia. That's I don't think people fully appreciate that.
That's a good
Your job is to save the Earth.
Keep it the way it is.
Keep it the
Well, there are lots of things that change, that have changed, and I think science does need to come up with innovative ways to save what we have now. I mean, it's not going to always. I mean, we have some answers right now, but it's going to require a lot of innovative methods, I think, and science is going to help in that regard as well.
Yeah.
Right. You might say we use technology to keep things the same in some ways.
Yeah. It's I don't think people haven't gotten used to that. They're, well, at least when I went to school,
Yeah.
we taught about advancing rather than preserving. But preserving has become more and more important. So let's talk about Guam, as you suggested. You're both working in Guam. Why Guam? What makes Guam so special? Why don't you start, Austin?
Sure. Well, for me, I'm from Guam. That's my home.
Chamorro. Are you a Chamorro?
Chamorro.
Chamorro. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have one of our staff is a Chamorro. Yeah.
Yeah, we're everywhere now.
Taking over.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Guam, so it's important that, well, for me personally, to take care of my home, but there are interesting ecosystems and interesting things that we can do in conservation that are applicable to not just Guam, but the rest of the Pacific Islands as well. I grew up snorkeling and fishing at an early age, and I saw over time some changes. The fish weren't as plentiful, the coral reefs weren't as colorful and vibrant as they used to be. And so I knew I wanted to study marine biology in order to find out what was going on and if there was a way to help with these issues. And so what I found after coming to school here and learning more about watershed ecosystems and how everything interacts, I went back home as part of my graduate research and met up with this community organization that's called the UH-Manoa Project. 24 years ago, well, actually before that, in the early 2000s, fishermen noticed that they weren't catching the same size and quality of fish as they used to.
Fishermen meaning fishermen,
Local fishers that
local, not commercial fishermen.
Correct. Yeah, fishing close to the shore for local reef fish that provided sustenance for people. It was also important for village fiestas, which are parties that we have several times a year in all the different villages.
Good fun.
Yeah.
Sounds terrific. Life in Guam.
Good food.
Yeah. Well, they wanted to find out why the fish in the village
Disappearing.
were smaller now, why they didn't taste the same.
Yeah.
The meat seemed a little more like rubber.
Yeah.
So
Ooh.
they reached out to the village mayor. Well, almost every village in Guam has a mayor, not like a big Honolulu mayor here. But that mayor reached out to the University of Guam, and they wanted to find out what was happening in the village. And they came in and they found that a few years back, actually 24 years ago, there was a road that was torn down, rebuilt, and expanded. And the government agencies that were responsible for that road construction failed to implement an environmental safety plan that would take care of the adjacent ecosystems. So they left huge mounds of sediment uncovered, and in a short period of time, when the heavy rains came, it washed into the ocean, smothering and killing large expanses of corals in just a 2-week period.
So you're talking about construction.
Yeah, construction.
But I'm looking at the little brief we have on you and Brenden, and Brenden is also talking about construction. You're both, it's a common denominator then. I guess
Yeah,
you're looking at
terrestrial
the
and marine.
ecological effects of doing construction in Guam.
That's one poor land use practice that causes environmental degradation, and there are also others. Perhaps the ecosystem could have recovered over time, but we have deer poachers in Guam that burn hillsides, entire hillsides, in order for them to catch deer more easily.
That is very inefficient,
It is.
at the least.
Well, for them, to catch their deer, it's pretty efficient, actually. But it's not efficient for protecting
For the rest of you.
The reef in the forest is
And that's
mess.
why we're doing a lot of educational outreach now to help these the deer poachers. We don't call them hunters. The people who are hunters do it in use proper methods. But anyway, we're trying to use outreach to explain that, you know, you're burning up here, and that's why you're not catching fish down below, because these hunters or these poachers are actually fishermen as well. So now we're trying to help them understand these watershed connections, and so that they can have better practices.
Are they listening?
Well, some people are.
Yeah.
There's just actually a few people left, but it only takes one person to
Make a
start
mess.
a huge fire.
Yeah.
It
So
really
is
points out
Guam-
the importance of education and outreach.
Yes,
too, right?
always.
It's
'Cause
critical.
every scientist has to think of that.
We need to do more and more of that.
Otherwise, you're in a silo.
Right, ivory tower.
So, what about Guam? Is Guam in distress environmentally? Is Guam? How would you compare Guam's situation with the situation in Oahu and maybe the neighbor islands? Is Guam near the tipping point?
Well, first, Guam is about a third the size of the island of Oahu, and we have a population of about 175,000 people. The top half of the island is completely different from the lower half. The top half is made up of limestone or old coral growth. The bottom half is volcanic, and that's where we see the hillsides and more of the erosion from that volcanic soil. We do have a lot of problems, but there's also a lot of hope there in Guam, because we have, let's say, about 350 species of coral there. It's really diverse, beautiful ecosystems. In all of Hawaii, we have probably about 100 to 150 species of coral. And if you went all the way to the Caribbean, they only have about 60 species of coral there. So there is a really beautiful, diverse ecosystem in Guam. Like Dr. Hollan mentioned, that Hawaii is a few steps ahead. There's lots of watershed alliances here, people working in conservation. Our organization, the Humatu Project, is one of the few organizations doing watershed conservation work right now. So there is hope as everybody is starting to learn more about the environmental issues in the islands. And
I want to explore that
yeah.
with both of you when we come back. We'll take a short break. This is ThinkTech Talks. We're on the SOAS Tower, but we're not talking about SOAS. I like that part. We're talking about new directions in environmental management. There's a great parallel. We're talking about Guam. We're talking with Brenden Halland, a professor, a member of the graduate faculty in Plant and Environmental Protection Sciences at CTAR, and Austin Shelton, who is a PhD student in the biology department's marine biology specialization program at UH-Manoa. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how you guys extend this and actually execute on trying to protect the environment. And maybe we'll have a few words or a few grimaces from Oscar as well. Be right back.
Hi, my name is Dr. Rafi. Every week, I'm right here at ThinkTech Hawaii, 3 p.m. on Mondays. My show is Boards' Bio Briefings. What do we do here? Well, we watch sperm swim. We see if they catch anybody. We check out the latest biosimilars. You know, the kind that, what was his name, the guy with the bicycle? I guess we forgot his name, but he was taking EPO and other human growth factors. We'll be talking about human growth factors. You want to know where to get some? Maybe I'll tell. Anyway, you can catch me, as I said, every week right here, Monday, 3 p.m., ThinkTech Hawaii, Dr. Rafi. You can also find me on Twitter, BioInfo Medical. Or you can catch me on Facebook, Dr. Rafael Boritzer. I'll be happy to converse with you. Aloha.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're ThinkTech Talks on the SOAS Tower, talking about new directions in environmental management, in Guam especially, with Brenden Halland and Austin Shelton, who are both doing research on environmental management in Guam primarily. So you talk about public outreach, public education, because it wouldn't mean too much if it was just scientists finding that this guy is invasive, or that construction of roads has a deleterious effect. But how do you actually reach out? This wasn't the job of the scientist years ago, was it?
No.
This has become the social consciousness, and executing on public policy issues is a new thing. So how do you do that in the crucible of your work?
I can start. One thing that we've started doing, I run a captive breeding facility for endangered tree snails. You're welcome to come by and visit sometime. We've opened
What's
up,
the fellow in Sitar who does the ocean snails that poison
Oh,
you?
yeah,
John Paul
Yeah, J.P. Bingham.
Bingham.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we work with JP a little bit. What we do is basically when there's a population of native tree snails that are, we're using this word collapse a lot today, but are under extreme pressure and at risk of immediate extinction, we'll go out with some of our field colleagues from the U.S. Army Environmental Division and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the DLNR, all of our partners in conservation, and make a decision about whether to bring in this species or not. So all the remaining snails sometimes are collected out of the trees, brought into our captive breeding facility, and basically kept safe from the predatory threats out there.
You try to breed them faster that way?
Well, they don't do anything fast, Jay.
What a silly question. Sorry about
They're
that.
snails,
I
yeah.
withdraw that question.
But this is really an example of island adaptation where they're just simply not competitive with invasive species. And I'll just show you real quick if we can get a shot of some of these shells. This is a genus of tree snails found only on the island of Oahu. The entire genus is listed as federally endangered. There were originally about 41 species in this genus on Oahu, and now we have only probably 9 or 10 left. So we've seen about 75% extinction of this one lineage. And invasive predators are now the main threat. Historically, we had other threats such as construction, deforestation. The Polynesians did a pretty good job of deforesting the lowlands.
Look at Easter Island. Look what happened
this
there.
is collapse.
That's the ultimate. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And Jared Diamond's book, titled Collapse, uses Easter Island as one of its environmental sort of focal points. That's what we're trying to avoid, right? Again, is that sort of level of collapse.
So you who do you go to? You publish, of course.
Right. So
you try to publish in non-scientific media to get the word out.
We do a bit of that. I think Austin does too. We also have opened up this breeding facility to the public, so we get school groups coming through, and more so. We had 90 fourth graders come through, last week from Noelani, and this is just a new sort of area. I believe that starting with the kids is really an effective strategy for increasing awareness, environmental awareness. The kids are not only very receptive to this new information, but they spread the word to their parents, and we think it's a really neat new direction to go in, and it is, as you say, something 10 years ago we didn't really think about this.
So how do you hope, to narrow it down to, say, him, how do you hope to stop him by public education, or stop his effects by public education?
It's a great question. I don't want to go on too long about this, but it takes a lot of time, man-hours, to clear a forest of these things. They're highly cryptic. They're up in the canopy of the forest, and we can go in, and after hundreds of hours, person hours, I should say, we can clear the forest of the species in an area. Now, what's going on is...
How do you do that? Trap them?
No, we go out at night with headlamps and very bright Q-beam
And they're attracted
flashlights.
to that?
No, they sleep. So they sleep at night, and they change colors a little bit. So they're a little bit of a contrast to the canopy at night, more so than during the day.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, they're highly diurnal. As soon as the sun goes down, they're asleep, and almost nothing can wake them up. So we do most of our collecting at night. That's when we get the biggest numbers. Now we're working against, in a way, the public. So Austin and I were talking about chameleons, and a lot of local kids are familiar. You can get them at the pet store still today, even though we've published papers showing that they're causing environmental damage. But what people do is they buy a chameleon at the pet store, and the pet store operator often will tell the customer, hey, you can come back here, buy crickets, and feed them crickets. Usually within a fairly short time, Jackson's chameleons get tired of eating crickets, and they'll have a hunger strike, and they'll die. And so if you don't diversify their diet, their health is impacted, they start to look bad, they start to starve to death, and well-meaning pet owners release them. And it's done with regularity. Now this is where
In order to save them.
they think they're doing the right thing, you know, they're
Yeah.
well-meaning, and we haven't done a good enough job to get the message out that this species is a pet, just as you would not release your cat or your dog in a national park or a forest area. You really should not release African
Why are they
lizards.
being offered for sale anyway? Because that's a dangerous, you have to
Right.
assume that some are going to get out, who knows?
Absolutely
you
right.
know.
That is something we are working towards changing the legislation. It's a really strange sort of a regulatory atmosphere right now. The state basically has made it illegal to release Jackson's chameleons, but no one knows that. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that. When I first moved here, I think my sophomore year of college, I picked up a Jackson chameleon, got the crickets from the store, and it didn't want to eat it after a while. But good thing it died on its own before I released it.
So since I think the late 90s, it's been illegal to release them, and the
I'm
public
sure
isn't
nobody
aware
knows.
of that. Nobody knows.
And if you do, what's going to happen to you? You know what it's like? It's
okay.
like the label on your pillow
yeah,
that says,
that's exactly.
do not remove under penalty of law.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Nobody knows.
Staple it to the chameleons. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to get the word out. It's illegal to release them. So as I say, it's an unusual kind of regulatory environment. You can buy them, you can keep them, but you can't release them. So now for a second reason, they cause environmental damage. Two good reasons not to release Jackson's chameleons.
I'm sure at the time this was originally made into a law somehow, we didn't know what we
Right.
know now.
And the pet shop owners, spoke out and said, hey, this is part of our
Business,
revenue,
yeah.
and why not? There's no
Right.
evidence. The
You'll put
scientists
us out
haven't
of
shown.
business.
Scientists haven't shown that they're causing any damage.
We'll lose
So-
jobs.
So yeah, they were in the environment for 40 plus years before any scientist documented damage. And so that is now kind of part of our mission now, is to really get the word out. Don't release these things. Keep them as pets. You have to diversify their diet too, so they'll eat a lot of different things.
So, on the other hand, you can educate the public about the value of tree snails.
Yes.
And that with no snails, no trees.
Well, just about. I mean, tree snails we think of as excellent indicator species for quality of pristine forests. Because they're so sensitive to invasive species and, in fact, plants and animals. So tree snails require native host trees. And so they're not going to live, in the back of Manoa Valley. They're the only populations that exist today are up in native forests. And so native forests that have tree snails, we know should be a priority to focus on, because that means there's no Jackson's chameleons. There are lots of other predators that are all invasive. And so yeah, indicator species of pristine, good quality native forest, which in turn impacts water quality. It's because again, these native forests capture, filter, and slowly release rainwater in a really effective
But
way.
the snails are in a symbiotic relation with the trees, right? I mean,
Not exactly. So they feed on fungus growing on the leaves, surface growing molds and fungus. We know that, oftentimes people will ask me, well, so do the trees need the snails? We know the snails need the trees. And we don't have any evidence of that, to be honest. I can just cite the fact that Kauai has no tree snails, and the same species of trees are doing just fine without tree snails.
So if I lose all the tree snails in a given pristine forest, how does that damage the forest?
Well, I mean, this kind of gets into a philosophical area. That by itself does not necessarily damage the forest. But these lineages evolved here over about 4 million years. And through our sort of short-sightedness and irresponsibility, we're losing these species that had existed just fine before contact. So, I think most biologists agree it's a better world with
Everything intact.
with the things that belong in place still there. We sort of tongue-in-cheek joke sometimes that do we want to live in a world with pigeons, rats, tilapia, the things that are being spread around
Right.
the world, they're not very
And
interesting. Jackson's chameleons, add them to the list, absolutely.
Well, but it shows that your science, sorry to say, is still in its infancy, because I think we can agree that everything has a relationship with everything else. In a given ecological system. They wouldn't be there if there were no relationship. And so we need to know much more about how every piece affects every other piece.
He's going for the snails now.
You think he's going to try to get through the plastic? Only kidding.
I don't think so.
He's a
He just
busy
wants
fellow.
to get out of here. Yeah.
He wants to look at my notes. But I mean, this all suggests that the I don't want to drop him.
Okay.
So now, one of the things that Austin talked about was the roadways. I know you're both involved in the implications of building roads and building anything. And I guess that's part of the science too. But and I would like to go through exactly how that works. When you build a road, how does that affect the fish? What's the chain of events that affect the fish?
Sure. Well, yeah, let me explain that and also try to get back to the educational outreach, how we show everybody how that works. Well, with the Humatu Project, the organization that I coordinate as part of my research, I go into classrooms and teach students from elementary school to college about the importance of coral reefs and watersheds. I have community meetings with the people in Humatic Village, and we meet with hunters, pass out free deer attractants like deer bait to encourage people to use other methods for hunting besides burning. And then the thing that has the biggest impact are what we call Humatic Watershed Adventures, where we take students and community members by the busloads from the top of the watershed where they see sources of erosion. We stop in the middle of the watershed and talk about the importance of managing stormwater runoff, and we show them what the road looks like and how it could be damaging. And what they did was when they built this road, there's a long section of just a gutter that collects the rainwater. And instead of properly letting that water trickle out into ponding basins or into different fields, it funnels it all directly into the river in that watershed. And so it's adding a lot of volume and a lot of velocity to the water. And as that goes through the river, it rips 30-year-old coconut trees off the side of the riverbank. It just pushes the sediment at very high rates down to the ocean. And once it gets onto the coral reefs, it smothers and kills them, because corals are sessile sedentary organisms, which means they're stuck in one place for their whole life. And so they can't get too much food on their own. And a long time ago, they developed a relationship with small plant cell organisms, single cell plant cell organisms, that provide up to 90% of the food for the coral animal. And so if you're blocking the sediment, you're blocking the sunlight with the sediment, those corals are going to die because they're not getting enough energy. And that's how the whole ecosystem gets affected from the road down
But
to
if
the
all
bay.
the sediment comes down and covers the corals, doesn't it sort of push the ocean floor back and
Well,
allow
it's-
for the growth of new corals further out?
Not exactly. Well, it is pushing. The land is encroaching on the sea, and it's pushing the corals further and further out. The drop-off of the reef isn't too far out, just a couple hundred yards. So it's going to get too deep too fast for those corals to grow there. Because they do
Nowhere
need
for
that,
them to go.
Yeah, they need that access to sunlight. So if they're too deep, they're not going to be able to survive down there.
Yeah. But I mean, how, I don't want to lose the point about asking about, education and action, but one question is, how are we going to have progress without building things? I mean, how do you build things without having a bad effect on the environment? Is there a way to do
There
that?
are lots
yeah.
of ways to build properly. I think in that one instance, in that watershed, it was a rush job, and they shouldn't have left those sediment piles uncovered. They shouldn't have made one long gutter. They could have been put into ponding basins to dissipate that energy of the water. And if you drive around Oahu, you see these things called sediment filter socks. that are around construction sites to act as barriers from that sediment getting into rain gutters and washing down to the ocean. And that's actually something we're using in the watershed management techniques in Guam as well.
We're going to take a short break. We'll come back, and I'd like to ask you to go further than education, talk about public policy, talk about statutes, regulations, and the like that you guys would think, that the state primarily, I guess, ought to focus on in order to ameliorate these problems. ThinkTech Talks, the SoWest Hour, New Directions in Environmental Management with Brenden Halland and Shelton. We'll be right back after the short break.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
We're back, we're live. We're ThinkTech Talks on the SoWest Hour, New Directions in Environmental Management through environmentalists, I guess I could say. More specifically, Brenden Halland, a member of the graduate faculty in Plant and Environmental Protection Sciences at CITAR, and Shelton, a PhD student in the Biology Department Marine Biology Specialization Program at UH-Manoa. So let me frame this. I mean, education is one thing. You want the public to be aware. You want them to know that if they make a mistake here, they're doing damage for their grandchildren. But what about the government? What about the Department of Agriculture? What about regulations? What about statutes? What about executive order from the administration? What do you think they should consider in order to ameliorate the problems we've been talking about?
I'll continue with this one example of a fairly recent introduction of a environmentally damaging invasive species, and that's the Jackson's chameleon. So, through a very simple act of the legislature, it could be made illegal quite easily. Period. To buy or sell Jackson's chameleons, and we think that legislation is way overdue. To be losing federally protected endangered species before our very eyes to invasive species that's in the pet trade still today is just ludicrous to us. And so, there are a few other simple things that, are sort of my pet peeves. Among them is the business of importing Christmas trees from the mainland. Every year, there are new lineages being brought in Christmas tree shipments, mostly from the Pacific Northwest. Bugs, reptiles, slugs, lots of potential pest insects, yellow jackets. We haven't had a snake introduced to the Hawaiian Islands yet, but at the level that the state is now inspecting those shipments, which is, I've heard, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the content of those containers is actually even looked at. So you open the doors of that container and out flies and crawls all manner of things that could cause long-lasting environmental damage.
Yeah, but just to go to that point, 5 or 10% of, say, a container of Christmas trees. Many
containers.
There's no logic there. If I tell you that 5% is clean, and I'm not sure that it is.
Exactly.
I have no assurance whatsoever that the other 95% is not dirty.
I myself found a large predatory lizard in a Christmas tree lot at City Mill. And I talk to those folks and they say, well, we don't know what to do when we find something weird that we don't recognize. Who are we supposed to call? And I said, you're supposed to call HDO. You're supposed to call the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. And they said, well, we don't even have that number. So, I think, again, outreach by the Ag Department could be much better as well. And I actually give my card out to Christmas tree lots, and so they'll call me if they get an alligator lizard or a invasive slug. Now the other side to that, the business side to that, which in a simple way, to my mind, makes more sense to encourage, say, Christmas tree farms in Hawaii, so the trees could be grown locally, could be business income for local businesses, and that would avoid bringing the trees from the
No,
mainland.
we have those
There are some of these, yeah,
evergreen
Maui.
trees. We what is it?
Yeah, the Norfolk pine.
Norfolk pine. You can
But you
see
can
them on
grow-
the Big Island. They're
You can grow
huge.
anything in Hawaii, so
Yeah.
they could be growing, any species of tree that people want for their Christmas tree needs. So we just don't need to rely
really
so much on bringing them in.
Silly.
Yeah.
It's archaic, isn't it? I mean, I think when we started doing that as a culture point, it was a long time ago. We had no idea
Right.
of what you guys are working in now.
Right, but
And
now we know better.
Now we know better.
Yeah.
We should adapt ourselves.
Yeah,
You know.
exactly. So,
What about you, Austin? Do you have any suggestions for the legislature?
Well, in Guam, for example, I'm not sure how much we could get done with the government. Money is always limited, and education and healthcare are always the priorities before we can ever trickle down to environmental issues. So with our community effort, we are trying to encourage the community to do more things. Since we started our effort, more than 1,800 volunteer hours have been contributed to the watershed by planting trees and putting in sediment filters to help decrease erosion on our own. And things seem to be working with that, and we are reaching out with social media and letting the senators, letting the government officials know what we are doing, and asking them to help spread this type of work to other areas in our island. And I think as more members of the community become aware of what can be done, they'll start pushing those government officials to put more money into areas of environmental concern that they do find important.
You know, I mean, talk about fish. You're talking about reef fish and fish close to shore, but the fisheries of the world are being fished out and dying for one reason or another. And one of these days, it's going to be very hard to find fish for your table. And that's good protein, and it won't be around. Maybe then everybody will get more excited about invasive species and the phenomena that you talked about with the sediment and the road building.
That's true. People are missing their fish, but then if you trade that with a can of Spam and you can find out you're not going to go hungry, then
Right.
it decreases the urgency there as well.
Yeah, it's just an erosion of a lifestyle. As the planet erodes, our lifestyles erode. True. So where do you see this going? I mean, you guys are, on an important issue. Are there more people going into this area of environmental management? Are more scientists coming up with greater levels of curiosity and identifying more species that we need to protect?
That's a great question. I feel like right now, I mean, maybe it's just I'm in this moment right now, but I have so many fantastic students and employees and interns who are so enthusiastic, positive, and what we're trying to do is come up with innovative, novel approaches to some of these problems, not keep doing the status quo that hasn't worked. And so I am very hopeful for some game-changing technologies and strategies. And we were just down, my group came down to the Fish and Wildlife Service last week, and I had 2 grad students and myself. We all gave proposals for funding for invasive species control, and these were all ideas that were novel and sort of outside of the box, maybe a little kooky, some of them, but I feel like it's time for these new and innovative approaches to be tried and see about feasibility.
What about Hawaii's role in all of this? I mean, Hawaii seems like, as Guam, I suppose, but maybe more Hawaii for some reason. I'd like your thoughts about that. Is this the place where this kind of science can have the best traction? Should we be the laboratory center for these discussions? Are we? Will we be?
I think absolutely. I think we are. You look at the brown tree snake problem on Guam, and we've kind of hovered around this concept of collapse. The bird fauna of Guam, I think everyone would agree, has collapsed. There are basically no more birds on Guam.
Oh, terrible.
And there were lineages of really amazing, fantastic flightless birds and just really neat birds. The Guam rail, which has been preserved as a species in captive propagation. There's over 130 of them in captive propagation, but they can't be released because the snakes just wipe them out.
The environment will get them.
Yeah, the snake. And so
the snake.
what the brown tree snake has done is it's silenced the forests of Guam. So when we're working in Guam, we don't hear birds. We hear insects, you know, and a 747 every now and then. But it's just kind of stunning to get there and realize, oh, what's missing? Birds are missing. And so a very interesting control strategy has been tried, and it made the media. It was on BBC and NPR, New York Times. The USGS, that's the United States Geologic Survey, came up with this pretty wacky sounding strategy of using dead mice laced with Tylenol. So this was based on a bunch of lab trials where they determined that a brown tree snake, A, will eat a dead mouse, and that was important to find out, and B, 200 milligrams of Tylenol will kill a brown tree snake. It's been tested with other native reptiles there, such as the monitor lizard, and found not to be a problem. So you scale that up to a level where you fly over in a helicopter and basically deploy 10,000 frozen dead mice over a plot of experimental forest where the density of brown tree snakes was known, and this is going on right now. And so then they come back and they start measuring and counting and doing surveys, transect surveys through that forest to see if this has had an impact on the tree snake numbers. Because the birds many of the birds are still there in captivity. So controlling this invasive species, everything else is still in place. You get rid of that species and then you can put the birds back in and roll back the hands of time.
Beautiful result.
Yeah.
Well, I hope more and more of that happens. That sounds very creative. I mean, there's risk in anything you do with the environment, but there are some things you have to do.
Absolutely. And now we know we have to do trials, you know, in advance to make sure that we've done due diligence to make sure we're not going to cause any unforeseen effects.
Well, I admire your curiosity and your work, gentlemen. This is ThinkTech Talks. We're talking on the SOWEST Hour today with new directions in environmental management with Brenden Halland and Austin Shelton. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming down.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Aloha.